session today with Kevin Bean, and who's introducing Gerrard Winstanley to us, who is one of the leaders of the True Levelers or the Diggers. I think they use both names. And we're very pleased to have Kevin with us from Paris. The internet is slightly choppy, but I think it's good enough. So thank you, Kevin, for joining us.
Okay, thanks, Tina. Good evening, comrades. I want to talk about Gerrard Winstanley for a number of reasons. One of which, of course, is that in England, in Britain generally, the revolutionary history of Britain, of the British working class, and of the various revolutionary movements that have arisen in the history of Britain is either often quite willfully ignored or really played down. So the sort of education that you might receive in history in many schools nowadays is one which actually, not only is it very sort of pick and mix and rather a la carte in that it jumps around as opposed to doing long chronological periods, but that's a methodological question. I won't get into that. But what it does tend to do is not, I think, look at the democratic and the radical, indeed the revolutionary traditions. And Gerrard Winstanley is a very important part of that. Now, this recognition of the importance of radical thinkers and what I think Wikipedia calls activists is that he develops, I think, some quite well thought out, well developed ideas of agrarian communism. And he does so in a revolutionary period in the 1640s and the 1650s. In that period, which many historians still refer to as the English Revolution, but large numbers of people try to play down and just infer that these are civil wars. And indeed, the teaching of this and the knowledge of this, as I've said, is actually fairly limited among wide sections of the population who've been through the school system. Now, this wasn't always the case, and perhaps a little personal background. I studied A-level history in the very early 70s, and I had to sit a paper which was entitled The English Revolution. And in the course of my studies for that option, I had to read this level of material, true level of material, the level of material, and actually learn about the debates on the English Revolution. So for me and for many people in that period of the late 1960s and the 1970s, people who were on the left, and these groups were very real and very much alive, and many people took inspiration from them. And so I think it's a tradition that we need to rebuild and re-emphasize. And this is why this rather long preamble about the importance of it, I think, is necessary. I'd also like to do a small mention for a group in Wigan in Lancashire who run an annual Diggers Festival. And that festival was cancelled this year by the Borough Council because it coincided with the funeral of the late Queen. And I suppose the irony of cancelling a festival dedicated to some revolutionary Republicans because of the death of the monarch was one that was lost on quite a few of them. But also, people like the Wigan Diggers Festival are doing their best to keep alive the memory of these movements. And so I think it's quite important to recognize that and for us to do something of the same. So the preamble's over. What I've placed, I hope will go onto the LLA's education page, are a couple of websites which actually contain some of Winstanley's writings. And they're from the Marxist Internet Archive. You can buy copies of Winstanley's writings. The collected works run to about £220, but there are smaller edited editions and selected works which you can buy for around about £15 or £20, and they're make very interesting reading. So Gerrard Winstanley then is a radical thinker. Is a radical thinker from the 1640s and 1650s. He's born in 1609, lives, I think, into the 1670s. So he lives in one of the most turbulent periods of English history, lives in the height of the English Revolution, and much of his political work is a reaction to that. Now, I think there are a couple of things to remember about Winstanley. He's not from the poorest sections of English society at the time. He comes from what in the language of the time is called the middling sort. I suppose maybe petty bourgeois. His father is a small trader, maybe a dealer in clothes. And indeed, when Winstanley goes to London, when he leaves Wigan and goes to London to become an apprentice, it will be as a sort of commercial career. In other words, a sort of, a commercial entrepreneur. But he is, like many other people, affected by the events that are going on around him. And although it's not clear as to the sort of active part that he played in politics in the 1640s, for example, it seems unlikely that he was actually involved in the Civil War itself, in the fighting, that he was probably based in London and continuing to be involved in trade and commercial activities. Certainly the politics of the period influenced him, as did the religious controversies. And I think what we see in Winstanley is a reaction to these events, an attempt to try and make sense of them. And in that, he's like, tens of thousands of other people. The English Revolution, which conventionally is just seen as a struggle between king and parliament, actually is a much more complex struggle. It is correctly described as a bourgeois revolution. Again, attempts have been made to play that down, but it clearly does follow that character. But it also has within it, as with the French Revolution and indeed all sorts of other revolutionary movements, a number of different currents and forces. So that, for example, there is a radical movement amongst the ranks of the army, amongst the ranks of the London apprentices, amongst the rural poor, all of whom are attempting to ensure that their interests, and in the case of some sections of the army, quite developed political programs are implemented. So what we have is a civil war. We have the overthrow of the king. King will be executed in 1649. And it means that much of the established order is called into question. So if you want to make a comparison, and it's a very limited comparison, but I think you'll understand, it's rather like the period in Europe after the First World War or after the Second World War, in which the old order has been swept away. And the question is what sort of new order is going to come into existence. And in the late 1640s, for example, after the defeat of the king, attempts are made by essentially the right wing of the parliamentary forces to come to some sort of rapprochement with the king. And the king is a fairly treacherous character, personally treacherous, but he's defending his class interests and his absolute monarchy. And they attempt to negotiate with him, but he either attempts alliances with other powers or attempts to wriggle out of any sort of commitments. So the left wing of the army, particularly identified with Oliver Cromwell, come to the understanding that the king and any form of monarchical power, cannot guarantee the success of their program. And although Cromwell represents, in a sense, the left wing of the bourgeoisie. He's certainly not a communist or a socialist, and indeed, wants to maintain existing property relations. But the overthrow of the king and then his execution in 1649 leaves open, really, not just the forms of government, but I think that the whole set of property relations. And, in that way, every aspect of life is called into question. And because of the relationship between religion and politics, between religion and state power and social and economic power, that means that we have a period of some ferment, which is often expressed in religious terms. It means as well, of course, that the struggles of the in the revolutionary period often take on a religious form. And I want to just make a point about this, in particular in terms of Winstanley, Winstanley's language and so forth. Winstanley does write in a particular religious form, and I think it's important to recognize that that is not just a conventional way of writing, that it does express a set of beliefs. But I think when we read it, and I will read out some sections, you'll understand that to the people of the 17th century, a belief in God, or certainly the belief in some form of divine order, would be a way of explaining politics and indeed of trying to make sense of the world. So even when the struggle appears to be initially religious, for example, in the 1640s over the degree of religious censorship or over the degree of centralized power within a church, this was often as well because of the interdependence of religion and politics. This was often a conflict over politics and above all over the economic and social order. Now, I've talked about the various forces, and one of the forces that are very much on the left, represented in the army, and indeed outside of the army amongst the London apprentices and sections of the lower classes in the population, are the levellers. And the levellers would represent, or do represent, the sort of left wing of the revolution. Now their aims, and I mean, if comrades can recall, it's actually a few years ago now, John Rees, who's written on this period and written on the levellers, did a talk on in an earlier forerunner of this series, and it's well worth looking at and well worth reading the book. Now, the levellers were radical Democrats rather than communists or socialists. They essentially wanted a democratic form of government, but they were very much based on small property ownership. So it would be sort of farmers and artisans. And indeed, their argument was that anybody who was a wage worker or a servant could not be truly free, and therefore could not really take part in politics. But the levellers did push for a democratic settlement, and this is you can perhaps read about this and see this the sort of cut and thrust and debate on this in 1647 in the Putney debates. The Putney debates were discussions involving army officers and representatives of the rank and file. There was actually a meeting described as the General Council of the Army, in which the various regiments elected representatives who were called agitators to come and speak and to put forward their ideas about the type of political settlement that should exist. So in the period that we're talking about, there's a real ferment of democratic ideas. There's a general ferment, I think, generally, socially, politically, religiously, and all sorts of ideas are being discussed, all sorts of options about the government of the country, about the issues of religion and education, really across the whole gamut. And this is not only because of the revolutionary period of the Civil War and the overthrow of the old political order, but also because of the ending of censorship and the ending of the controls that the Church of England had over certain aspects of political and social life. So in this period, we do get, a mass of writing, a mass of discussion, and this has been, very well described by Christopher Hill in a book written, I was going to say, 30 years ago, but I've just realized it's probably now getting close to 50 years ago, 40 years ago, certainly. And he describes this as the world turned upside down. And again, this is taken from a title of a pamphlet in this period. And it must have seemed to contemporaries that the world was truly turned upside down, that the monarch had been overthrown, and all of the old institutions were now up for grabs. So it's into this type of world that we see Gerrard Winstanley emerging as a political thinker and activist. Winstanley was probably active and probably connected to the Levellers in London. Again, the evidence is circumstantial, but it's very clear that in describing himself as a true Leveller, he's arguing that he wants to take the Leveller political project, considerably further. And I suppose in that sense, it's rather like those of us on the left who might argue that we're in favour of democracy or in favour of a republic, or indeed in favour of a whole series of reforms and changes. But we only see that as the beginnings or a partial process of more revolutionary change. He begins, I suppose, to agitate and argue for these ideas, but the first sort of embodiment of them is the establishment of his digger sort of collective or commune in 1649 on St. George's Hill in Surrey. By one of the ironies of history, this is now one of the most exclusive parts of the country. It's now one of the wealthiest parts of the country. It's not far from Cobham, Weybridge. It's actually, a very, very wealthy area. And in fact, I think St. George's Hill itself is now the site of a sort of private, almost gated community. So the irony is that the site of one of England's first communist experiments is now a sort of bastion of private enterprise and private property. But I'm sure the irony wouldn't be lost on Winstanley. What essentially happens is that Winstanley and a group of followers decide that they will cultivate and maintain an area of common land, and the common land is in many ways a bit of a wasteland. It's used often for just grazing cattle, some sheep as well, and they decide that what they want to do with it is to grow vegetables on it. Now, the debate about the common land and what you did with the land is, of course, central to an agrarian society. And why the diggers, I think, have this sort of inspirational power is that the issue of controlling land, and particularly the future of the common land, had been an important feature in English politics and society from the 15th century at least. What we're experiencing in this period is the breakdown of feudal property relations and the development of capitalist market property relations, particularly in the south and the east of the country, where you have quite intensive agriculture for the market. And of course, that type of intensive agriculture often turns upon, pardon me, on pasture land. It turns on the grazing of animals. And famously, when Marx writes about this, he describes the way that enclosure, and indeed he will write about this extensively when it comes to Ireland, the way that enclosure of land leads to depopulation, and in which the owners of property would rather raise up animals than raise up people. And talks about the sort of people being forced off of the land and the population being replaced by sheep in that way. The other point is that the common land, and the term still survives. I mean, it may well be that some of you live in towns and cities where there are still commons, and this might be a bit of open land where anybody can walk their dog, or even keep horses and cattle. I'm aware, for example, that in Cambridge there's Jesus Common down by the River Cam, and certain people, I think Freeman of Cambridge, can keep their animals on that common land. Now, of course, what is happening throughout our period, but it reaches something of an intensity in the 17th century, is that the common land is being enclosed, it's being taken, and it's being enclosed by landowners, and it's in a sense being privatized. And of course, this land isn't just a bit of a leisure resource. For many poor people, the rights to keep animals on the common land, or even to grow certain amounts of food, or to collect wood, are important ways of surviving. And of course, when this is also combined with changes in landholding forms, it has the effects of depopulating, and indeed driving many people from the land, or indeed, forcing them to become effectively, wanderers, unemployed, in the language at the time, thieves and vagabonds, who often just roam around the country. The poor laws, which were introduced in the early 17th century, or one form of the poor laws in that period, are designed to deal with this social issue as far as the state is concerned. So when Winstanley and his followers go to St George's Hill and take over this common land, which is essentially just going to waste, they're making a very clear political point. And they're making a point that the land should not be simply wasted, that the land should not be owned individually, but should be kept collectively. And of course, in an agrarian society in which agriculture and some low levels of handicraft are the main means of earning a living, this means that the means of production should be owned collectively. And that, I think, is a significant point, because there is a long tradition, particularly, of agrarian resistance in the early 17th century, and it's likely again that there are echoes of this for Winstanley in the area of Wigan where he comes from, and incidentally, there's a village of Winstanley in Wigan, in the Wigan area. There were movements to defend the common land, and indeed the phrase leveller may also refer to the idea of pushing down the fences that were enclosing the common land. Now, initially, Winstanley's efforts are seen as something of a freak. After all, there are all sorts of profits arising, all sorts of people putting forward ideas in this period. But I think what gives Winstanley his potency isn't just that the government continues, but it actually seems to draw a degree of support in the surrounding areas. Again, we can't really be sure quite whether there are deliberate attempts to spread the movement, or whether, for example, his movement is simply one that we've got that is well documented, because there are reports really across the southeast, the Midlands, of similar agrarian experiments taking place. Now, the way that this is often styled and presented is as a sort of form of agrarian utopianism, and it is, I suppose, to our eyes, it may have a certain sort of simple value. Certainly in the late 60s and the 70s, I see Dave Hill mentions this in the chat, but I'm sure he'll remember it, that there was a certain sort of semi-hippie-ish idea of getting back to the land, simplicity, and of course the whole utopian idea of returning to a simpler type of existence, was very appealing. And that strand of utopianism Marx refers to it in the Communist Manifesto. It's there in Chartism and in lots of sort of, idea in urban life. But this is not, I think, just simply some sort of little project.
Sorry, Kevin. Kevin,
Yeah.
your internet was wonky there. Can you say sort of the last 2-3 sentences again? Sorry.
Okay. Yeah. So what I was trying
The
to
Communist Manifesto and that kind of program.
So yeah. So this sort of utopian idea was present in the 19th century when industrialization is starting to become intensive, and you can sort of see the attractions for many people are returning to the land. The first generations of people living in towns and working in factories, will find that very very attractive. We'll see it as an alternative, although it is rather utopian in a sense to try and turn back the clock from industrial production to a purely agrarian society. The Chartist land scheme is a good example of this, which might be worth a session in another time. But we also have to remember that for Winstanley and for these people, that the agrarian mode of production was their mode of production. So this is not a sort of escapism, which it might be for us if we all go and live on a farm somewhere. They were taking control of the means of production. It was the only one available to them. I mean, there was artisan production and so on, but if you were talking about making your living in the 17th century, this was the way to do it. So, pardon me, sorry. So this experiment, and what is interesting is that it's seen as an experiment, as a way of, in a sense, setting up an example, is, I think, a significant one. The other important point, of course, is that like many other people who are experimenting or putting forward new ideas in this period, the local landowners, the religious authorities in the area cannot tolerate it, and they suppress it. They do it in various ways. What's interesting is that in the political turmoil of this period, that the diggers actually use the actually use the sort of existing laws, and indeed on occasions appeal to the highest authority, General Fairfax, who is the commander-in-chief of the army and in a sense has a key role in the new political system that's emerging. But it's a combination of essentially vigilante activity with the local landowners employing people to just go and beat up the diggers and destroy their settlement and so forth. And that, combined with some legal opposition, both at St. George's Hill and elsewhere, means that by 1650, the settlement has been dispersed. And Winstanley's sort of practical attempts at developing a sort of example of agrarian communism have gone. But what hasn't gone is his ability to write, and indeed what starts to develop in this later period is a whole series of pamphlets and quite extensive writings in which he puts forward his ideas of the government of the Commonwealth. And it's this which I just want to sort of close on for a moment. In 1642, his most developed program is, I think, much more explicitly political. One of the things in his writings is that he often starts with a religious idea, and in particular, that idea drawn from the Bible of the equality of all mankind. The idea that God has made man in his image, and that the distinctions that have emerged after the fall, after leaving the Garden of Eden, being expelled from the Garden of Eden, but that they are not God-made, they're man-made, and indeed they are the products of, in some senses, robbery, but they're certainly not a set of inequalities instituted by God. And in particular, in the Law of Freedom, Winstanley identifies God and reason, and in particular the idea that we can find political and social solutions to the problems that we face. So he argues that through debate, that rather than simply impose solutions, that through the light of reason and through discussion, we will be able to arrive at some sort of democratic idea that benefits, all of us. This is quite an important move, because in some of his earlier writings, which were more explicitly religious and talked about righteousness, he was tending to stress that the scriptures laid down a sort of set of rules, so that all you would need to do would be, for example, to look at the book of Samuel, or to look at Judges, and find there a set of guidance about how you might run a society. And it does seem that increasingly he's starting to see reason, a sort of God-given reason, which, for those of you who are familiar with the religious ideas of the inner light, and particularly the ideas that will influence Quakerism, these ideas are much more democratic, because they're in a sense talking about how man is a rational actor, and can arrive at new forms in this way, and that this is not something that goes against the law of God. Indeed, it's in tune with the law of God. So the argument then is that the earth is a common treasury to is a common treasury open to all, in the famous phrase, and that rather like the Garden of Eden, it's one that we should reclaim. Now, the question is, how do we reclaim it? And this is where I think Winstanley, although undoubtedly a utopian thinker, is not really an explicitly political activist. So unlike the Levellers, who attempt, for example, to build a party, or indeed attempt to develop political support inside the army, Winstanley tends, I think, in a sense, to set up blueprints and ideas. And because I suppose by the 1650s, the main dynamic period of the revolution is over, he now looks for other forces to introduce these. So rather than, for example, and I don't want to make Winstanley into some modern figure, but he's not talking about a movement that will mobilize, thousands or tens of thousands of people to introduce these changes. He doesn't see, I think, in what is in many ways the defeat of the radical phase of the revolution, he doesn't see a force that can do this. Indeed, this is the period when Oliver Cromwell has become Lord Protector, and we have, in many senses, a sort of pseudo-monarchy. And although Cromwell carries out a number of constitutional experiments, essentially we have a form of government by a kingly type figure with advisors. But Winstanley puts forward the blueprint in the Law of Freedom for what is essentially an agrarian communist society. Now, this blueprint is very detailed, and again, you can look at it. You can look at how he suggests the economy and society should be organized. I mean, it has some very interesting features about education, about democracy, but it also has a great deal of paternalism within it. And although it does assume the collective ownership of property, it does, I think, assume a rather natural patriarchy, in which, and I mean that both in the sense of men, but also in the sense of the sort of wiser, older heads in the community will, in a sense, have an important role. And so in many ways, it's not as radically democratic as perhaps would have been what we might have expected, but it still is clearly agrarian communism, and it still is talking about forms of collective ownership and also collective democracy. And so from that point of view, it's a more developed political approach. But the interesting thing is that he's putting forward these ideas to be implemented, but by not some sort of mass movement of true levelers, but in fact by Oliver Cromwell. And he actually puts a preface in the book to His Excellency Oliver Cromwell, and more or less says to him, well, you know, you should implement this. But there are several sort of barbs within this. And again, you can see the problem of people in both the period in which the sort of dynamics of the revolution seem to have faded and indeed have failed, in that he makes the point very strongly that many people have given up their lives fighting for the freedom of the Commonwealth, that the soldiers have done their bit, and that now that all that has happened is that the king has been overthrown, but the old property relations seem to have been reimposed. The other element that is, I think, quite important in there, both in the Law of Freedom, but also in some of his earlier writings, is the reference to some sort of historical development, and particularly an image which is going to become quite important in the later period, the idea of the Norman yoke, that monarchy is a product of the Norman period from 1066, and that a new ruling class came into England with the Norman conquest, and that has now been overthrown. Interestingly, unlike some of the Norman yoke theorists, he doesn't exaggerate the utopian nature of Saxon England, but he does make the point in real historical senses that the aristocracy and the ownership of property is as a product of conquest and exploitation, and does not simply see it as sort of a natural process. He wrote a series of pamphlets, but essentially was no longer politically active, and indeed for the rest of his life seems to have either pursued a sort of just a rather conventional career, you know, in trade, sometimes working as an estate manager, and increasingly just becoming a sort of local figure who takes part in the local life in Surrey. And so in some ways his great public role is in 1649, but he does leave a legacy, I think, of these ideas, and a legacy that was recognized by many Marxist figures in the later period, Karl Kautsky and Edward Bernstein, the two German theorists, not always the, you know, not always quite on the right side of history, but they recognized him and other agrarian figures of this period to be, you know, in a sense, pointing towards a revolutionary tradition in England. And indeed, something which I didn't know until I was preparing this talk, in a monument that was erected in Moscow in the early years of the Soviet Union, as sort of almost like a monument to revolutionary figures in history, presumably starting with Spartacus, that Winstanley's name is there. And, you know, in that sense, he's recognized. I think he's worthy of study, not only because of what he writes and the sense of his sort of sense of a vision. And I think it's often important to sort of see the ideas that, you know, enthused people in the past, but also to try to show that all countries have a revolutionary tradition, and that the movements that we're trying to build today not only have their antecedents, but also are very much, you know, part of a much longer struggle, and that people like Winstanley, you know, do represent, I think, a step forward for the ideas of the time, and they also represent, you know, that desire of people in revolutionary periods to sort of put their stamp on things. We could be critical of Winstanley. We can argue he should have done this or done that. And, you know, he's very much a man of his time. His politics and his ideas are expressed in the language of the time, but he is an inspiration, and he does show the way that new ideas can come into existence, and the fact that people are capable of seeing beyond where they are, sort of reaching for that future, and in particular saying, well, that future can be grasped, that future can be made, that we can actually, build the world anew in that way. And I think it is that idea which I always find very inspiring in him. So
Thank you very much, Kevin. That was very interesting as always. Spartacus, we need somebody to introduce Spartacus, clearly. If anybody in the audience feels the urge to research Spartacus a little bit, that would make an interesting introduction, I think, for our series. Comrades, if you have any questions or comments, please click raise hand or put it in the chat or put your question in the Q&A. So Kevin, maybe I'll get the ball rolling. Where are you going? Kevin, you think you can take a break now, can you? He might just get a drink. We'll leave him off the hook. Okay, just get a drink. Yeah, so Steve Freeman, I think you were going to come in later, so feel free to come in. Interesting thing about all these people who went before Marx is obviously that they tend to be on the utopian side. But I do have a couple of questions. So this was all during the period when common land was privatized and the transition to, as you described, the transition to capitalism. And Marx writes about that as well, that struggle. But can you perhaps, from their perspective at that time, how did people, if you know it, experience this taking away of the land? What did it mean for them? And did they understand, you think, that there was a new system in the making that would, take the power from, would move from feudalism towards something else, towards privatization? And then also I found it interesting when you talked about the landlords eventually sort of fighting back and trying to reclaim that land and kind of using almost like Pinkerton type detective agency to smash up people. How that went? Did they also, were they as brutal as the Pinkertons, etc.? And how long were these struggles going on between the common land and how long did that period take where they fought over the common land, if you know the answer?
Yeah, I think first of all, what you're really talking about is a sense of sort of dispossession, and this is, I think, as I wanted to stress about this agrarian communism, that it was a means of production. And I suppose the equivalent might well be when people lose jobs, when their jobs are automated and then they're made unemployed or they're made destitute. So it was seen as a new system. Even figures who would be perhaps part of the establishment, the period, the ruling class, were aware of this being a new system. Thomas More, when he wrote Utopia, is very aware that enclosure, will be destabilizing. And indeed, governments did introduce various acts from the late 15th century to try and curb enclosure. So it was not just a sort of symbolic act. I think it was very much recognized this was something new, and that in particular that people left the land. So leaving the land was, again, not just simply something that might be sort of construed as psychological or people having to move to a new area. They could no longer feed themselves, their families, and so on. So I think that might be the way to explain it. The other thing is, it was often understood in terms of tradition that these were rights which had been won and had been, long held. And often in some of the legal cases, and there were legal cases, I mean, we've got a lot of documentation, both by enclosing landlords and by the resistance. There were occasions in which tenants and commoners and others could afford to hire a lawyer to defend the claim and say that this is the common land. that they often base this on traditional rights and said this is new, and in particular the idea of the new men who were doing this. I mean, this is also in combination, certainly in the 16th century, with a whole lot of other changes. I mean, you've got the dissolution of the monasteries and the shifting of property around that. So there's quite a lot going on in agrarian society. There's also very high rates of inflation in the 16th century. So there's a lot of disruption to what are seen as sort of fixed patterns. And, you know, in a way, I think it is quite comparable to the process of what happens later in the Industrial Revolution in that way. The struggle does continue over a long period. And you might argue that the struggle against enclosure and the struggle for common land is still going on in parts of England well into the early 19th century. And indeed, the sort of sense of commercial capitalist ethics of making money, and that the profit making of the individual or the elite in comparison of the welfare of the many, you know, was an important theme. I mentioned Chartism, and what's interesting in some sections of Chartism are that there are these sort of rather agrarian utopian ideas about coming back to the land, but also, and again, this rather surprised me when I looked at this recently, that there were some Chartists who wanted to sort of enlist the help of landowners, aristocrats, even the monarchy, to restore a type of right order, you know, in that way. So there is a certain, this is often expressed in conservative terms, but it's not simply a desire to preserve something for the sake of preserving it. It is actually vital. You know, you may remember, Tina, that Marx did some of his first writing, political writing, about the gathering of wood in forests in, you know, southwestern Germany. And this wasn't just, this was a vital necessity. It might well return again if the fuel shortage, you know, yeah. So in that way, there is a, you know, there is a long struggle, and you know, Winstanley's experiments are an important part of that, but they're much more than that, you know. And I wanted to say that he does have a blueprint of the idea of the law of freedom, and you know, the idea of a free society. And, you know, this is more than just saying let's stop enclosure, but it does explain why this particular sort of act is really quite central.
But then you also said in comparison to the levelers, who were so called by their, you know, opponents, who tried to build an organization of some sort, he and the true levelers, the diggers, didn't really do that. They went further with their program. You know, so they kind of questioned private property as well. But they didn't see the need to organize as such. Did they actually sort of interlink somehow? Did they work together, or were they totally separate?
Well, I mean, it's hard to tell from what we know, because after all, we're in a period in which, you know, records of memberships and so on and so forth, you know, don't exist. I think it would be quite clear, and we know from some of the individuals involved in the diggers were former soldiers and were former radicals. In some ways, you can interpret St. George's Hill as a sort of reaction to the defeat of the levelers. If I get my dates right, I think that the diggers first sort of cut the ground, as it were, in early April 1649, and I think that it's about a month later at Burford that Cromwell decisively defeats the levelers in the army. So in some ways, I think it might well be almost a sort of quietist reaction, you know, the way that after a revolutionary movement that seems to have been defeated, people almost go off and sort of plough their own furrow. So no pun intended on that. But the other point as well is that there are people in sort of religiously inspired radical movements, say like the Fifth Monarchists, who do favour sort of militant action, but it's sort of rather unclear. I mean, they talk about a rising, and they plot and they attempt or work with ideas of a coup involving the army and establishing a sort of military dictatorship, a sort of religious military dictatorship, which I think would probably, in their own mind, would have not have been unlike someone like Thomas Müntzer in Germany, or the Münster Commune in the 1520s. And they were quite militant and were prepared to use force. Winstanley wasn't, and I suspect that his was more a sort of almost giving witness. So in terms of practical action, you could be critical of it. It was a sort of sense of saying, we will set up an example and everybody will see how marvelous it is and society will change. And even, he said, well, the landowners will see that this works much better. The priests will see that this works much better. And so there is a utopian element in that.
Mm. Okay, we've got a couple of comrades now with their hands up. Marie first, please.
Hello. Thank you, Kevin. This is superb stuff. I have just comments which will be limited by how much I know about this, but I find it all very moving. The fact that there is something you said about Winstanley looked at the Norman conquest, and there he identified, or at least as you expressed it better, he became aware that conquest and inequality and barbarism of one man against another, that was not just God-given, that it was the result of conquest. And I think that this is very important thought. It's a thought which is leaving the orbit of religious contemplation, where you think everything is depending on God. I think this is an enormous advance in the process of thought. And in that case, in that sense, this was revolutionary, according to me, regardless of what he said about the Normans, which is another question. That he put reason as what will in fact allow unity and the elimination of dispute. This is also very moving. I think that, of course, in those days, it could only be an aspiration, but you already had that notion that reasonable ideas have the ability to convince, and that therefore one doesn't have to submit stupidly or without thought the injunctions of people in power. That also is revolutionary. And it seems to me this is already speaking to history, is speaking to us. You used the phrase, he was giving witness in another context, but I think in this context as well, he was putting religion within a framework where the human being had a role. It wasn't just everything to be left to God. I find that revolutionary. I saw somewhere that he identifies the original source of dispute as the brother who took from his brother. He expropriated his brother. That is, to me, this means that he was trying to put in context the why is it that we have to kill in order to live? Why do we have to live in such abject subjection or constantly having to take from others in order to live? And then the enclosures is an overall arching question behind this. Finally, because I would want to say much more, I'm going to bring this to a conclusion. I think that what he shows, what Winstanley shows is an epoch which was obviously boosted by a revolutionary process. It wasn't just him who was a genius, but that he was inspired by others who were equally advancing like he was, and he gave it a form. It shows that human intelligence did not have to depend on the formation, didn't have to depend on material conditions to eliminate private property, that already it could see beyond private property. But also at the same time, the instrument which actually implemented what it seems to me he was looking for was the proletariat. And it's only with Marx, which means the proletariat, that there came the notion of private property. That phrase is the expression of the understanding of what the problem is and the material base for it. And it's only because the working class came that this notion could be developed. And then with the worker state, which myself I considered the first years of the Soviet Union to have been, with the worker state, then there was the Soviet with the ability to exchange ideas and to convince each other, the peasantry and the working class, which talked to each other and got together to actually transform society. That was done with a communication at the level of intelligence and reason, not at the level of imposition. That came only afterwards. And then finally, yes, I think that two small aspects. There was already during his life the experience that you have to address the soldiers and to appeal to them, and that the soldiers can play a revolutionary role. I think this is still valid today in some instances, in some contexts, and that the idea of the priests and the landowners, that they could actually be addressed, because in the Chinese Revolution, some of the landowners who had been expropriated joined the commune. And one of them, I've got a book on it, is called The Cripple Tree. That landowner said, I live much better now in the commune than I used to do when I owned all that land and I wasn't doing anything with it. Yeah. Thank you, Kevin, for your talk.
Thank you, Marie. Kevin, do you want to reply now, or do you want to hear a few more people?
I'll take two or three other people, Tina.
Steve, then, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Tina, and thank you, Kevin. That was excellent talk and very informative. And I'm not disagreeing with anything you said, hopefully to try to add a bit to it or just say a couple of other things. What I probably want to emphasize is the relevance of this for today. You know what I mean? I think that's what there's always a danger we think this is just history, is it's got no particular relevance today. And I think it has, and you've already made that point, so I'm only emphasizing that. But even a term like the Commonwealth, which meant a republic, but I think it always meant more than that. It meant about the welfare of the people. It meant the idea of a social republic, which they never achieved, of course, because they didn't even achieve democracy in 1649, as we know. But nevertheless, the idea of the Commonwealth, which Tony Benn used that term, and I think it's one we should expropriate and use again today. I think it's a powerful idea and a powerful term. And I think the land question, also neglected one on the left, generally speaking. But there is so much to be discussed about land. Then, as Winstanley did, and indeed as we need to discuss it today in the Republican Labour Working Group, we've been discussing the whole land question and what our attitude should be towards land. So, and I think that is something, again, when I look at the policies and programs of the left, we tend to forget about this, and yet so much does hang on that. So obviously, we're not talking about repeating the Commonwealth of 16. We're talking about a higher Commonwealth of 2022 than the one of 1649, building upon that. But I want to go back and make a couple of other points. One is just to go back to the discussion we had last week when we were talking about republicanism. And then I want to end by just referring to what Winstanley said about, I think something that's also very relevant, when he talked about kingly power and his observations on kingly power. So I'll come back to that. But remember last week, and that's why I think it's so significant, remember last week when we were talking about Republicans, I was saying the left in England is mainly dominated by left reformism or left social democracy or left social monarchism, i.e. the programme of 1945, restoring the 1945 social monarchy, which was essentially what the Labour Party was doing in its 2017 and 2019 manifesto. There was no real republicanism in the Labour, in Corbyn's politics, or indeed in the politics of most of the left. And then you have this other extreme, which is equally opposed to republicanism, which is really what you might call it revolutionary socialism, or you might call it left communism. But there's a whole different set of people like the Socialist Workers' Party who are no more interested in republicanism than Jeremy Corbyn was. And then I said, we've got this third trend that's not recognised of Republican socialism. And I can see Tina and yourself and myself and Mike, who were speaking last week, are all part of that. We may have different versions of it, obviously, and different takes on it. But if we want to find where does Republican socialism come back, this period is essentially it, isn't it? It's where in the levelers we have the republicanism of the levelers, and in the diggers we have the true levelers. We have the socialism of the diggers. And the festival in Wigan is such an important thing to show that we can actually mobilise and interest a heck of a lot of people by looking at the history of this, our own revolutionary period, the largely forgotten revolutionary period, of course. You know, we're left to talk about the Russian Revolution till the cows come home, but didn't really say much about our own revolution, our important revolution in the 17th century. And so in a way, what the revolution also tells us, because this is still before capitalism proper, so, you know, it's a sort of Republican socialism before there was Republican socialism. But it does show us that the Republic comes first. The Republic opened the door to Winstanley. If the Republic and the Commonwealth hadn't been declared, if the king had not been overthrown, if the king had not been executed, that gave Winstanley the opportunity for his group to go and occupy the land in St. George's Hill. And the authority of the old order couldn't just immediately come and boot them off. I mean, as you say, when the New Model Army turned up, they kind of went away again because they didn't really want to take them on, not least because the soldiers sitting on the horses and probably thinking, hang on a minute, these people are a bit like us. And so the diggers were able to do for a while, of course, but they went down in the counter-revolution against the levelers as well. But republicanism was merely the opening of the door to socialism. And we have to bear that in mind. If we're not fighting for republicanism, we're not really fighting for socialism, because we're not fighting to open the door to the social transformation that we need. So I think Republican socialism, therefore, is got its roots here. And it's a powerful tool that we have. We didn't just come up with Republican socialism last week, last year, or whatever. It's got deep and long historical roots. Now, just come back to make a specific point that Winstanley makes. So I'll finish on this point. Winstanley talks about kingly power, which is a great idea. And he makes two, I think, really insightful arguments about kingly power. One is he speaks of it being, I couldn't find the quote because I wish I'd had the quote in front of me and I couldn't find it in time, but he speaks about it being a great spreading oak tree. So the idea is you can lop off the branches of kingly power at the top, but the roots are so deeply embedded in society, in the soil, as it were, that even if you lop off some of the branches or the ones at the top, it'll come back again. It'll be restored, because you've got to go further. You've got to dig up the whole roots of kingly power, and not just sort of superficially. So it tells us in a way that it's not just about getting rid of the king. When we did get rid of the king, we won't really have destroyed kingly power. I think that's such an important point that he makes. And then he has another point, which he says, and I did manage to find this quote. Hold on a minute, this is a quote from him. Well, my paraphrase of it. He says that either the Commonwealth, he's speaking in 1649, either the Commonwealth is going to succeed and it's going to give a better life for the people, and it's going to give us peace in God's kingdom, as it were, or however he's expressing it. Or He says the monarchy will be restored, or the monarchy will be restored. But he says either it'll be restored as the king who will rule on his own, or alternatively, a few people will rule in the name of the king. Now, so the one to rule is the king, the monarchy, but the few to rule in the name of the king is an oligarchy. And you might argue that really what happened in this period was that we never got the monarchy back again. Formally we did, but really the rule of one man was never really right. What we actually got was the crown, kingly power being exercised by a few people, by a group of people, by a class of people linked to the City of London, etc. So in this period, and I think Winstanley's observation on this is right, we have got kingly power still, but it's not one king. It is the crown, the power of an oligarchy ruling us. So there we are. That's my 2 penneth, 3 penneth. Okay.
Thank you, Steve. Do you want some more, Kevin?
No. Okay. Just bring in the next speaker, and then I'll come then after the next.
This is Gabby. Hello, Gabby.
Hi, Tina. 2 very short things. The first is that I don't know if you ever saw it, but in the 70s, Kevin Brownlow did a film about Winstanley. It was a very short film, it was black and white. And I remember being quite impressed by it, particularly the scene where when they were called up in front of the judge, they didn't have any money for a lawyer. And they said, well, we'll defend ourselves. And I remember the judge saying, are you sure? And he said, yes, we'll defend ourselves. And it was only when the other lawyer began to speak that they realized that the whole process was going to be in Latin. So that was the end of that case. But I did think it was interesting. But if you had seen it, I wondered how true to life you thought it. Well, not that you were there at the time. I know you're not that old, but I wondered if you had seen it, what you thought about it in terms of how it conflates with what you've been saying. That's number one. Number two is Robert Harris. I used to be a history teacher, but the level of history that I taught was a fairly low level. And I used a lot of literature to novels and whatnot, and poetry and what have you, to sort of open up history for some of the young people I was teaching. And Robert Harris has just this year published a book called Act of Oblivion, which is about what happened to the people, the men who signed the death warrant of the king. And I was very pleased to see that 3 of them who absolutely got away because they went to the United States. So in Connecticut, there are streets named after them because they became quite famous in the United States and became part of the Quaker community there. And I thought that was fascinating. And the description of what they did to the guys they did catch. I mean, I've read it before. I remember reading Samuel Pepys wrote in his diary at one point that he went out before breakfast to see somebody hanged at Tyburn. And his comment was, he looked as cheerful as any man could under the circumstances, which I actually quite like too. But I wondered if you'd seen the film and if you knew about it. And the book is very good. Well, I like Robert Harris anyway, but it is really interesting. It's fascinating for me anyway.
Thanks, Gabby. Kevin, there's one more question in the chat, which is a very short one. Is the question if the depopulation caused by the Black Death in that period, running in the centuries before that, if that had any influence on the level of the resistance there. I think Marx called it the golden age of the proletariat, when there was when they actually could achieve some gains, but I think that might have been a bit earlier than that. But anyway, so if you could sum up as well in your in your reply now, that'd be fantastic. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, and thanks for the questions and comments. I'll take the first one or the last one first, Tina. There's actually some recent research on the post-Black Death period, which does agree with the assessment. I mean, simply in the aftermath of the Black Death, the population of large parts of Europe fell, possibly by as much as a third. And of course, there was a labour shortage. And in that period, you get people being able to bargain for better wages. And I think just immediately after the Black Death, I can never remember its exact date, the Statute of Labourers was an attempt to try and control wages because workers were demanding higher pay, which of course they could get. And the attempt was made to restrict that. I think it's 1351, but if some comrade can correct me, it's certainly in that period. But the other thing that's interesting in some recent research, some recent books, particularly based upon wills and other evidence of material possessions, is that there is something of a boosting of urban living standards. And indeed, sumptuary laws, the laws that regulate dress in relation to your social class, are also increasingly introduced because people from the lower classes are now able to afford to buy more luxurious raiment. And this again sort of is unsettling. This period, and again, we're now probably around about 200 years before Winstanley, but this period of the later Middle Ages into the transition into, I suppose, the early periods of modernity, to use a sociological term, or capitalism, are much more dynamic. You know, our picture of the sort of later Middle Ages as sort of, you know, a load of peasants going around in sacks and sort of living in the mud is in many ways quite inaccurate. And in many areas, the small farmers, peasants, land labourers and so on are organising. And of course, you know, the German peasant wars that we'll see in the early 16th century, or the English Peasants' Revolt, are all examples of that. So I think, you know, I think they show that change. Whether there is whether there's a direct link, I think there is an awareness. We have some evidence from this period, particularly in the pamphlets, an awareness both of the earlier peasant movements and, as Marie says, a sort of sense of history, you know, that people are looking at historical development and not just simply seeing the world as being static. So from that regard, I think there is an indirect influence. But I think the other thing that emerges both, and this will largely come from the voices of opponents of these movements, is their sophistication. You know, and this actually goes for all sorts of dissenters, religious dissenters and political dissenters. Reading the reports of trials of people who are brought before the authorities and charged with sort of religious and political dissent, and you know they will be executed, but you know they're very eloquent defenses of basic democratic rights and freedoms. And it's quite inspiring to read, say, a shoemaker being brought for trial and telling a member of the local elite that I am as good as you are, and you know we are equals. It's quite a powerful statement of radical democracy. Gabby, I'm familiar with the Robert Harris book. I've actually got a copy of it, but have not yet had time to get around to reading it, and I'm really looking forward to it. Yeah, the regicides were certainly given a fairly severe treatment. Cromwell, although he was dead, was dug up and executed again. And the regicides were arrested, executed. Some were just imprisoned. A number of them did escape, obviously, to New England, which had to wait a little while to become the United States. But their there's a wider relationship, I think, between this revolutionary period and what happens in America. You know, the American Revolution draws directly on this period. And I think it, again, is important to note the way that all the great revolutions, all the great European revolutions are linked. You know, the French Revolution took inspiration for what was done in England and America. And I think that's quite an important point to note. I am familiar with the film. I've seen it several times. I actually did see it in the 70s. And I recently got it again to look at it. Funnily enough, the Wigan Diggers Festival are a little critical of it, and they do that because I think on not a particularly good basis. They largely complain that Winstanley's accent is too posh and too southern, which I'm not sure. I mean, the words in the film come directly from Winstanley, and if you read his writings, you'll see more or less that they've used his writings and his account of what happens as the text. And that's actually the other thing that I get real enjoyment out of reading this material, is that the very direct language, you know, that these are people who are trying to express, you know, complex ideas and are trying to reach people, and they're often expressed both poetically but also very directly in that way. The interesting thing about the film is that the filmmakers were effectively sort of amateurs, and the cast of the film were really friends and neighbours. And so in many ways, it's a bit like a Ken Loach or a Mike Leigh film. It's also quite amusing, if you know the work of those filmmakers, that they had previously made a film using some of the same actors. In fact, the man who played Winstanley in their previous film had played a British fascist leader in a film about an imaginary Nazi occupation of Britain. And to see him in one film ranting as a Nazi, and then in the second one ranting or talking as Winstanley, was, you know, a little disorienting. But the film's very good. And there are also a couple of novels, one by David Cowt called Comrade Jacob, which is also worth reading. So yeah, it is a good film. And I think insofar as we can understand, certainly the language is that of Winstanley himself. And some of the incidents in the film, particularly the presence of, you know, rather bizarre sort of libertine radicals. Again, there are splits in the community, and so on. So I think it's well worth reading. Steve, I think, makes a very important point, and it was one that came up in our discussion last week. And if comrades hadn't seen it yet, it's well worth looking at. And in a sense, it was a good discussion because it went really beyond the usual issues about monarchy. And you're quite right. I looked in terms of Winstanley's approach to monarchy, and I looked just as you were talking at the Law of Freedom, and he does talk about the fact that you cannot have you know, a new Commonwealth with kingly laws, and he does make this point about the way that monarchy permeates the whole of society. And I think what came out in our discussion last week wasn't just the usual political arguments about the nature of the state and so on, which, you know, we've discussed many times before, but what you might call the monarchical principle as counterposed to a democratic republican principle of one-man management and of authority resting and, you know, in a sense, authority over us as opposed to self-government. You know, and genuine democracy and expression of opinion. So I think Winstanley's certainly arriving at that. Although, and just to, without making him sound almost something like a saint, there is also some sections in there when he's looking at the legal system, and he does, in a sense, possibly drawing on his own experience. And again, it's something that came out in our discussions. he talked about how far you would need to have degrees of coercion, and indeed whether you could simply leap from the present system of oppression into a new period, a new commonwealth, and how far you would need oppressive laws to almost, in a sense, make people be good and fit into the commonwealth, which of course is has always been a discussion in terms of social change. And he does sort of address that question there. Lastly, on Marie's point, yes, I agree entirely. Particularly, I think about not lessons as such, because Winstanley is in a very different period, and the fact that the land is the main means of production gives the land question a very different significance than it has for us, certainly in most of the capitalist economies in Europe. Not all of them. Land is important in some areas, but it's not that we sort of draw lessons, but I think we understand, or we can sort of see how people have struggled with the idea of a new society, with the transformation of society. And that isn't just an inspiration, but it's their modes of thought. And I think you explained that very well in terms of looking at society as a sort of organism that was sort of made by man and therefore can be transformed and changed by man. And although, Winstanley does have a sort of religious framework, and he's probably moving to almost not quite to theism, but he's certainly the personal God who sort of intervenes to strike down the wrongdoer. It isn't really part of Winstanley's schema. That I think does represent a step forward. Anyway, comrades, I'll wind up. The internet reception is not great, and look forward to discussing this and other questions in the future.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I think we've all learned again something, which is always useful. Please join us next week when Roger Silverman will introduce his father, Sidney Silverman, which also sounds rather interesting. He was a bit shy about it at first, but I've convinced him that it's not a problem to introduce your own father. Quite the opposite. You know him best, probably. Okay, comrades, see you next week. And thanks, Kevin. Thanks for everybody. Bye-bye.